wrapping that up and move on to whatever comes next. But I'm not actually originally from the Midwest. My wife is from Minnesota, but I grew up in Washington State, but spent about 5 years pastoring a church right next to Duluth, Minnesota, on the Wisconsin side of the river, but up by Duluth prior to coming here to Duke. So thanks for having me, and it's good to be with you all. I did make a point to at least make it to one session of the summer Bible study before having to come up here and teach a session. So hopefully what I'm doing today feels somewhat normal and coherent to all of you. But apologies if something comes out of left field today, but it'll be too unusual. So we've got a bit of a task ahead of us today. Chapters, 1 Corinthians chapters 12 and 14, I looked it up, and this is the longest chunk of text for the summer, 71 verses. So I say that just to highlight that we will not be able to say everything that there is to say about this passage. Even reading through it all would take some time. I did print off some copies if you do not have a Bible with you of these two chapters, but I had to put it in 10-point font to be able to get it on one front and back page. So that's just speaking to exactly how much there is in this. So if anybody would like a copy of that, I can pass those around and you can grab them if needed. But I want to start with just a few premises for you that I'm using to approach this text and this study. I don't say these to say that they're anything terribly profound or that they are unique to me, but just as a starting point, a foundation for us to build on for the way we're going to think about this text today. So let's make sure this continues to work. Can we move the people aside, the people there? Just a little bit so that see that text there. So just a few things to say by way of approach. First of all, I look at 1 Corinthians, and to me it seems that this is very much practical theology in this book. Compare it to, say, Romans, where we get a lot of more propositional theology, where Paul is really laying out what is the gospel, what does it all mean. Here, Paul is very much concerned with sort of the boots on the ground impact of how does this gospel that we talk about actually work itself out. And I think that maybe that's partly why we're going through 1 Corinthians this summer, talking about community. How is it that this gospel actually changes things for us? How does the gospel work itself out in life and community? This letter seems to be written, some of this may have been said earlier in the summer when I wasn't here, but just in case, but this letter seems to have been written to a community that was mostly Gentile Christian as opposed to Jewish Christian. Paul is at least speaking more towards the Gentile Christians in that community than towards the Jewish Christians. Explaining those sort of real world implications of the gospel. And I think he's really here just demonstrating the way that the gospel comes in and transforms systems and structures of societies and communities as the way of Jesus gets translated into those new contexts. But he's not necessarily interested in just tossing everything out and starting from scratch. This is sort of it's that transformation of the thing that is. Richard Hayes, a Duke Divinity name, if you're familiar with Richard Hayes, he terms this in one of his books, The Conversion of the Imagination, where Paul is inviting in 1 Corinthians, he's inviting the Corinthians to think about themselves, their lives, their world, their society, their relationships, imagine them in a new way based on this gospel that has come to them. So all of that is tied up in that first premise, that this is very practical theology, the working out of the gospel in real life. My second premise, again, nothing terribly profound, but we have to read this passage in context. Doing a Bible study like this, obviously we take smaller chunks and we look at it in depth, but I think it's important to not lose the forest for the trees as we are reading through this. We have to think of chapter 12 and 14 in relationship to the rest of what comes around it, in relationship to the broad sweep of the letter. And notably, we're taking a look here at 12 and 14, right? But what about 13? Now, I'm not going to step on Daniel's toes too much for next week, but we can't forget about chapter 13 that comes in the middle of this and what chapter 13 does for 12 and 14. So we're going to just touch on that briefly, but I'll leave most of the meat of chapter 13 for Daniel next week to talk about. But I don't think we can just totally ignore it and skip over it. Then lastly, I just think I want to think broadly about these chapters. Again, not to lose the forest for the trees, not to get so bogged down in details, particularly as these are chapters that in some contexts, and maybe some of you are from denominations, more charismatic denominations, where these are very influential chapters talking about the gift of tongues, the gift of prophecy. What does all that mean? We could get pretty bogged down on that, but I really want to keep us more thinking about how the broad sweep of these chapters, what is the theme and the message that these chapters give to us in relationship to the whole of Corinthians. So any questions or pushback on any of that before we move along? All right. So our key verse that was chosen for us, I guess we'll say, this morning is 1 Corinthians 14:26, where Paul says, "What should be done then, my brothers and sisters? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up." So we will think about that a bit this morning, but I invite you to just keep them in the back of your mind as we read through some of these chapters, and as we think about these, and then we'll come back to that later on. The last thing I wanted to do is just to show you this outline for a few moments. Again, going back to that premise about thinking through the broad context of Corinthians, just to remind ourselves of where we've been with Corinthians and the little bit that is yet to come. But Corinthians largely is composed of two main parts. After we have our introduction, and we've got some conclusion down at the end, but it's really composed of two main parts where Paul is responding to some problems that have been reported to him in the body, and then he's responding to a letter that the Corinthians sent to him. And that's where we get this chunk of chapters 12 and 14 over here, where he's talking about marriage, food sacrifice to idols, the rights of the apostles, conduct and worship, and then he gets to this section on spiritual gifts. And this is a rather lengthy section, about 3 chapters, where he's talking about this issue that presumably the Corinthians have written to him about, asking some questions. We don't know exactly what those questions were, but Paul certainly gives a lengthy response for us. And then there's a couple other issues that he takes on after that. But so it's within this context of Paul this letter was sent to him asking questions about how, presumably prophecy, tongues, spiritual gifts, how all these things were supposed to function within the body of Christ, within the church. And so he is sending them something back, giving them some guidance about whatever these presenting issues were that were sent to him. So with that, I'd like to start, and maybe we'll take this one chapter at a time, but I invite you to divide up into some groups. take a glance through this chapter, starting with chapter 12, and let's read and just discuss for a few minutes. I've written some very broad guiding questions for you to consider, but think about what sticks out in this passage. First in chapter 12, what are Paul's primary concerns that he seems to be writing about? How does this passage demonstrate that conversion of the imagination that Richard Hayes refers to? And how does this passage fit within the overarching framework, the overarching argument of 1 Corinthians? So if you take just a few minutes, it's about 10 o'clock right now. We have until 10:45, is that right? Okay. So let's take about 10 minutes or so to read and discuss, and then we'll come back together and talk about chapter 12 for a few minutes, then we'll do the same thing for chapter 14. So I will put the online folks into a breakout room if that's okay. Actually, I'll ask, sure, maybe you can do that. And then you want these in 2 groups, 3 groups? And then maybe 3 or 4 groups, whatever, however you feel like dividing yourselves up.
Well.
Yeah, well, I can, yeah. Yeah. If I also hear.
Does it mean both sides?
I think.
I'm not asking. Right?
Here's the question.
I think chapter 12 is on one side and chapter
14 is on the other one.
I'm pulling it up on my phone because I can mark it.
It is funny. You got me doing this, putting it on my nose.
And then he wants us to.
What sticks out in
Yeah.
Immediately following most of them.
So
It's a lot of stuff
what
here.
passage do we have? I mean, the whole thing.
I think the whole thing, which is, where he's talking about spiritual gifts and he talks.
You kind of keep the whole picture in mind.
It's where he has the analogy of, many parts of the body, but one body.
Yeah, right. Writing materials
And then
were scarce and expensive at that time. And Paul really takes a lot of time to dissect the concept of one body. So we've got to infer that it's quite important for Paul to spend this much time in life. At the end.
You writing this from prison? No.
A lot of that, nobody use that verse in a lot of ways. The love is patient, love is kind.
Yeah, the end of this sets up for the chapter 13
Yeah.
very well, talking about love. I feel like the overall theme of this chapter is he's trying to encourage them to work together and to celebrate what each unique person brings to the table. They're not things like that one person is more important than another because they have different gifts, but that they all work together. And then he continually says to do everything to build up the church, which I think is also.
Yeah, I know that all things, but I think that's just human nature. If someone is somewhat different from me, you're using those precautions. You don't like it.
Yeah, because we don't understand, we're afraid.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think what he's encouraging. I think it's interesting that,
I can imagine.
I
can imagine from a personal quality talk about them, but
seems like a foreigner, nobody.
yeah, I'm sure it's. Spirit for this question.
You know what
I have international students, like where maybe there's parents don't always understand what I'm telling them about their child's lesson. And that has sound.
I mean,
It's
there's
the
not
best thing I could do. I don't understand.
So here, of saying.
I just look at them and smile.
Everyone here
So there
has
are some
special
like
gifts.
universal
also,
things
like,
like you
everyone
they're
is
just
like
suggestions
right
of body language, and even if they don't understand your words.
I can imagine
Like,
people
then
saying,
they
well, if
can,
they.
like, get
speak in
it,
tongues,
like,
like,
okay, she doesn't know what I'm saying, but
feeling,
she's okay
well,
with
that's
it, she's gonna.
We're better. We can do
We've got our Zoom people back, so let's wrap up our conversations here in the room. So let's just go around and I'll invite each of you, each group to answer just whichever of those questions you care to answer. Or whatever came up in your conversation. So anyone want to start us? Including online, you're welcome to start us.
Well, our group can go. I don't know. Do y'all? Okay. We'll go. We talked a lot about how you wanted like his analogy that he gave, where there are many parts of the body and many parts of the church, and how you want to make sure that everybody understands that they play a vital role, no matter what that role may be, no matter how different that role may be, that you all play a vital role in coming together to make up the church, and that you should work together to build up the church and to build up each other. He brought up love, of course, how that segues into chapter 13. I think the idea of community is very much seen here, and that you want to edify the people around you. Other things that we mentioned, okay, that was like the big thing. There may be other things that we'll look.
Save time for others.
Yeah.
I was struck by the conversion of the imagination for the Corinthians regarding many spirits, many gods, many temples, to trying to get them to think about one spirit. When one comes up regarding one spirit, it's a real shift for them in their understanding of what spiritual world is.
And that all gifts come from that one spirit. That's sort of the basis of the unity of the church, right? Here. You want to share?
We talked a lot about how this fit into the overarching argument of community, and kind of this continues to bring people together when there seems to be a lot of division. You can imagine almost the primary concern is that, oh, well, I'm healing and they're speaking tongues, but I mean, I'm helping people, so that should be better. You know, you can almost hear like this based on other kind of moments in this book, you can hear the arguments or the pushbacks against all these different gifts that people are showing up with. And also, I can imagine people are really forgetting that the Holy Spirit is the basis of it. So, you know, oh, does it come from me? Do I have superpowers? You know, like, what, am I this powerful? And I can always, I can just hear them talking to Paul, asking them that question. So that's what we kind of talked about with primary concerns. And we said what sticks out to us is kind of what's already been mentioned, but the same body, different gifts, or same body, different parts. And it was mentioned that Paul really writes a lot on this, so clearly this is very important to him.
Right. What about on Zoom? Anyone on there want to say anything? Christian, you're muted.
He's giving us some good stuff there.
Christian, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. We talked about how some of these gifts, they may have been ranked, that speaking in tongues and interpretation are at the bottom of the list. That may or may not be a kind of ranking thing. One that we mentioned that the spirit, or I mentioned that the word for spiritual gifts that Paul uses here in Greek is charismata. We get our charismatic words from that. And one thing I might mention is that this is very, very early in the church. I mean, we're talking 51, 52 AD. There are not, we haven't gotten to the point of having officers, an administrator. I think there is a gift of administration, but by the time you get to the pastoral letters to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, we have bishops, we have elders, we have deacons, we have a much more the administratively structured church, whereas this is Corinthians is a charismatic instruction church. And then we talked about speaking in tongues, sort of going out practice after 3rd century and being revived in the Pentecostalism in the 20th century.
Yeah, so I think you've all hit on the kind of primary themes of this chapter. I just, it seems that what Paul is indicating here is that there are some people who are kind of establishing a hierarchy based on gifts within the church. And even though tongues, this is in verse 28, even though it's at the end of the list, it seemed like because Paul is spending so much time talking about speaking in tongues, that actually this was kind of the considered, the gift to have if you're going to have a spiritual gift. It was the sort of highest status kind of gift. But Paul is, it seems here, trying to really sort of tamp down on that and say, now, wait a second. Number one, there is no hierarchy because every gift is needed, right? That's the whole body imagery. It's interesting that oftentimes this body metaphor in the Greco-Roman world was used when it was written about, it was used to talk about, well, the man is the head of the household in Greco-Roman society. And then, so it's at the top and then everything else goes down. It's a hierarchical metaphor. But here, Paul really subverts it to say, actually, you need your appendix too. I don't know what the appendix is for, but the appendix is just as important, right? The liver is just as important as the heart. You can't have one part and not another. You can't just cut off your hand and get around with just your feet. We need all the parts. For a healthy, functioning body of Christ, we need all the parts. We can't all be eyes, we can't all be hands, but everything is important. So there is no real hierarchy, but rather all gifts are important. And this isn't the first time we've seen these sort of hierarchy issues in Corinthians, right? We also saw this at the table, at the communion table, where some were asserting privilege over others around the Eucharist. We've seen this in terms of a sort of hierarchy of apostles. Who's the most important? Is it Paul or is it Apollos? But Paul is saying, no, these divisions that you're setting up, these hierarchies that you're setting up for one another they're false. They're not what the church is supposed to be about. The church is about being a body together, where every part is valued and important. So let's ask then, before we move into chapter 14, so what is chapter 13 doing in the midst of this discussion? Anybody want to chime in on that off the cuff?
Well, in many ways, as he turns from the end of 12, we got this complete change of tone. though I speak with tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. So this is a completely new concept. Talk about a conversion of the imagination.
Right. Yeah, all of these things that they've been focused on, right? The tongues, the prophecy. Paul comes in and says, if you don't have the very, I call it the simple gift of love, then none of that stuff actually matters. Love is the foundation for all of it. And we'll let Daniel next week talk more about this chapter and sort of unpack the meaning of that love. But I think it's significant here that Paul brings this into, I think he's essentially saying everybody has access to the gift of love. Not everybody will speak in tongues, not everybody will prophesy, not everybody is a teacher, but everybody can love. And if that doesn't form the foundation and the basis for the entire church, if that isn't the foundation upon which you build everything else up, then it's all clanging gongs and clashing cymbals and all that. So any last comment before we move on to chapter 14? Chapter 12, chapter 13.
That's another thought, to go into the point, it's not even called the gift here in this whole chapter. It doesn't even say the gift of love like it does the gift of faith earlier in chapter 12. And we don't know about hope either, whether that's a gift or not, but
Yeah,
it supports your view that love is not a gift, but universal, something everyone has.
yeah. And maybe just looking at the last verse of chapter 12 there, Paul says, but strive for the greater gifts, but I'll show you a more excellent way. So is love a gift? I don't know, maybe not in that language. I'm going to show you something greater than even having these so-called gifts. Let's take a few minutes then and go into chapter 14 and. Oh, sorry.
Just 1 second. Christian, I want to go back. You said, did I hear you say that the speaking in tongues was sort of dormant between the 3rd century and the 20th century?
Pretty much. You had a couple of this sounds bad, outbreaks at a couple of points in the Middle Ages, but it was really the 20th century, beginning December 31st, 1900, when small group in Kansas, a woman named Agnes Osmond spoke in tongues. Charles Parham, who led the group, then went to Texas, converted W.J. Seymour, an African-American pastor who went to California, began the Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles, which lasted from 1906 to 1909, and people came from all over the world to that. And he speaking in tongues was sort of the major aspect associated with that. So it was a really huge rebirth there in the first decade of the 20th century.
It's fascinating. I think that this gift of the Spirit was not visible for 17th century. 17th.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's interesting.
Or we don't know about it.
Or we don't know about it.
Yeah.
Was the Holy Spirit quiet on that, or people had learned that it was not the most excellent way, or
The historians might not have captured it. They may have been doing it in private, as Paul was encouraging, and so people didn't know.
Yeah.
They weren't doing it out in the open.
Or in Africa, I mean, they didn't have the internet, so.
well, that's true.
And would you document it? The whole idea, would you document something that's that?
Yeah.
Who knows? I don't think we know.
Sorry, that was just a
No,
curiosity
thank you.
tidbit.
Thanks for that insight. Well, let's take a few minutes then and just talk about chapter 14. Same questions. What sticks out? What are the concerns? How does it fit in with the rest? And we'll tackle that and wrap up.
encouraging all to be a prophet. That's not good. You know, I'll be a prophet.
Amazing. People wanted to be the ones that.
It's interesting.
They wanted to
know it.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
well,
I mean, it's in this song.
Sounds like.
They must have planned that. So chapter 14, what are your primary takeaways? What sticks out? What do you think Paul was up to here? Thoughts?
We kind of continued a lot of the conversation from chapter 12, talking about community and building up the church, and, you know, like specifically with speaking in tongues. I think his big issue with, and we kind of touched on this already, but his big issue was it being done out in the open where people didn't really know what was going on. And so that's why he's kind of comparing the tongue to the prophecy. And that with speaking in tongues, that it might be better to do privately, or if you're going to do publicly, make sure there's somebody there who can interpret what you're doing so that those around can also be built up from that experience.
Right.
And so we talked about that and went into more detail about that. We did get into the women's stuff, and we talked about the historical context surrounding that. And that it, you know, is very specific to the time, but we think again, it centers around, you know, wanting to make sure that you're presenting something to the church body that's going to help them learn and grow.
Right.
I'll address that.
I was wondering if those verses were going to come up, and
Well, I don't email the men didn't want to. And I'm like, oh.
I did find some interesting discussion about those verses, you know, whether they were original to this letter, you know, all those questions, because in some ways it doesn't seem to fit with things that Paul said previously in First
Right.
Corinthians. And I don't know, they have too much more to say on that aside from, yeah, what Nelson's already brought up, so. Any other thoughts or takeaways from chapter 14?
I think Paul has a low tolerance for nonsense.
Yeah.
And, you know, he wants faith to make sense and be sort of thought out. He wants later on, he wants worship to make sense and be thought out. He's sort of encouraging and Morgan was talking about how just recognizing there are so many things that are just being defined and sort of being discussed plainly here, just to sort of, you know, Corinthians must have gotten it really wrong in the first place, that he's having to go and say, okay, this is what these utterances say, this is how to do worship, this is how to do this is how to do that. And you know, we may think that he got some of it wrong too, but he clearly feels a need to lay out all the basics.
Right.
We talked about women and concluded, I think, that at least a large number of New Testament scholars, perhaps the majority, don't think this passage 34 to 36 is authentic to First Corinthians. And we talked in terms of trying to understand New Testament prophecy as being not quite the same thing as Old Testament prophecy, but a gift spoken in the person with the gift of prophecy speaks within the worship service words, the words from God that are generally words of comfort and help to the specific congregation. And we do have some evidence of that from other early Christian writings, the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas.
Thank you. Anything else? But yeah, I appreciate everything you guys have said, and you know, I think the thing that sticks out to me is really Paul seems to be interested in sort of the utility of everything. Is this doing something for the church? Is it doing something positive for the building up of the church? And I think that brings us back to that key verse, let everything be done for building up. But it's this question of how are these gifts, whether it's tongues or prophecy or healing or teaching, how is that building up the community? How is it doing something not just for your own self-esteem, self-edification, but rather for the body? And, you know, to sort of, you know, I want to be careful not to move too far away from what this passage is immediately doing and its immediate meaning. But I think for us, you know, we might ask, well, what do we value and for what reason? Are we valuing things because of within the church, within worship? Are we valuing things for nostalgia's sake, for tradition, for prestige, which seems to be largely what the Corinthians were getting caught up in? And are there things in that sense that need to be discarded from our worship, if that's all they are? Is sort of status markers and things that create hierarchies and divisions. But again, the idea of just, it's about utility. If something isn't worthwhile for building up the body, then maybe it's not something that needs to be done in public, like the tongues. If it's just for you to stand up and have everybody look at you, then that's not best use of the time. We are just about out of time, so I want to just present you with, I think, a few key takeaways to sort of summarize our time. These are my key takeaways from this passage, but number one, just sort of the erasure of divisions and hierarchies. Within the church, we are one body, many members. Every member is important, not just the pastor who's up front preaching, not just those who stand up to serve the Eucharist, but every part of the body helps it to be a body. Number two, it's the primacy of love. That if you don't have that foundation, then all of the other things, they don't matter. The weight collapses on itself. Again, Daniel will unpack what exactly that love might mean next week with chapter 13. But I think for us today, that's evident as we just read 12 through 14, even skipping over chapter 13. Paul is very clear that love is the foundation. And then lastly, I just say, I think that there is a theme here, and this is something that we see throughout Corinthians, of seeking the good of the other and of the community and of the church. It's not just about us, but it's about the body and thinking about others. Again, I don't want to go too far, extrapolate too far from the immediate meaning of this passage, which is located in the Corinthian worship services, right? But I think we could take a small step and say, well, what lesson might we take from this passage, applying it to a society that is very individualistic, where we tend to think about, you know, our own selves, our own nuclear family, what is good for me and my family. But just to ask the question of, well, is there something that we can take from this about how we interact with other institutions, other groups and relationships beyond just the church family? And I think that's a valid move, because if the church is an outpost of God's kingdom, then shouldn't we think about modeling, that the church models the way we should be everywhere? That we should not think in terms of hierarchies and divisions with groups outside the church, but rather think about how we're building up those people around us in our neighborhoods and in our communities. That's all I have for you. Thank you for joining me this morning, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you online.
Thank you, Luke.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for teaching.
You're very welcome. Fun to touch on the New Testament.
To venture out.
Oh, there's a lot of activity
Yeah.
out there today.
I give them no place to park. And I'm always here. I can pick out any place I want usually, but it's full of them.
Do we know what's going on?
No.
There were a whole bunch of people. And I
No,
saw all the
no.
breakfast stuff.
Yeah.
Yes,
Sign up, sign about volleyball professional.